Hey, this is a tutorial on how to make objects warp into a point, warp into a singularity like a black hole. This is something I had to figure out when I wanted to make a bunch of objects warp into like this colorful UFO portal thing, and I was proud of myself for figuring that out, so I'm going to show you how to do it. First, I'm going to add a mesh to warp. I just added a donut here, press Ctrl 2 to give it a subdivision surface modifier and make it shade smooth. Then I'll add an empty and move it somewhere else. This is the point that the donut is going to warp to. Then I'll give this donut a geometry nodes modifier, add a set position node. Then I'll drag my empty into the geometry node modifier, set it to relative, and add a position node. Now this position node outputs the position of all of the vertices of the donut as they are currently. So if I plug that into the set position node, nothing happens because I'm telling it to set its position to its current position. Now if I plug the location of the empty into the position, I'm telling the mesh to set the position of all of its vertices into a single point in space. So the entire mesh has basically collapsed into that location. Now I want this donut to transition in between these two states. So I'll add a mixed node, set it to vector, plug the position into vector A, plug the location of the empty into vector B, and plug that into the position. Now the factor going from 0 to 1 affects how much this donut will collapse into the empty. But right now, because the factor is affecting all of the vertices at once, the donut just scales in, and I want it to kind of stretch. So we need the factor to affect the vertices individually. Basically, I want the vertices to collapse more depending on their distance from the empty. So I'll add a vector math node, set it to distance, plug in the position of the vertices and the location of the empty, and I want the distance to affect the factor, so I'll plug the distance into the factor and the donut is gone. This is because when the factor has a value of 1, the donut collapses into the empty, so now because the distance is plugged into the factor, whenever the donut is a distance greater than 1 meter, it collapses. We want to reverse these values so a distance of 0 collapses it, and anything further than 1 meter will allow it to be a donut again. And the way we can adjust these values and reverse them is by adding a map range node. Now I can flip the 2 min and 2 max values. So instead of setting the factor from 0 to 1, I want it to set the factor from 1 to 0. And now these from minimum and from maximum values are going to be the minimum and maximum distance that the donut will start warping into the empty. Also, having these minimum and maximum values far apart makes this effect more subtle. When they're closer together, the effect becomes more intense. Also notice how when the maximum value goes over the mesh and the vertices start to be affected, they start to pull in very sharply and it creates this obvious angle. So I can add a float curve after the map range node and bring this point down to create like a kind of slope, so the effect happens more gradually. Now that this setup is done, I can move the empty anywhere I want, I can move the object anywhere I want, I can add in more objects and give them the same modifier, and from here the effect just kind of works automatically. You don't need to do any more work. Now to animate this, I would plug these two values into the group input, and first I would keyframe the maximum value to go past the mesh, and then keyframe the minimum value in the same way, so it also goes past the mesh, and it collapses into the empty. And that is how you make objects warp into a point like a, do the thing that I was talking about earlier.